So when we look at the spines of books, all we need is the title and a bit of colour. But within the spine, there are lots of pages, and the pages have a huge story, and that story is part of your life, a little part of your life. Anyway, you were going to tell me about one book that was called Morocco, I think. So why?
The book Morocco.
Yes, tell us about that one.
And that was one that I bought, I guess, soon after I got back from going to Morocco when I was a student.
Yeah.
So we went off to Morocco in 1972 for about 5 weeks.
Yeah.
With 25 undergraduates in a Land Rover and a Ford Transit.
Yeah.
And that took us down through Europe, of course.
Yes. Oh, so you drove from London to Morocco?
All the way down and all the way back.
Wow.
And went round Morocco and literally up through the Atlas Mountains.
Yes.
Round the southwest of the Atlas Mountains on the Sahara side.
Yeah.
Right down to Mesquite Oasis, and then back up over the Atlas, camped there, climbed the highest mountain in North Africa.
Yes.
And then drove back.
So where did you cross the Mediterranean?
From Ceuta to Algeciras.
Okay, so which is just around the corner from. It's just around the corner from Gibraltar, isn't it?
Absolutely, but you couldn't go from Spain to Gibraltar in 1972.
No,
or not easily.
No.
So we went down to the Spanish port and across from there.
Yes, yeah, interesting.
That was, and of course, Ceuta in Morocco was essentially a Spanish enclave.
Yes, yes. I mean, what was the sort of greatest impact of Morocco on you as a young man at that time?
Well, I suppose the only travel outside Britain I'd done was places like Brittany and Austria and Switzerland.
Yeah.
And suddenly you were in Africa.
Yeah.
And it was new, very new. And there were the glories of, I suppose, Islamic architecture, Roman remains, large Roman remains at Volubilis. The idea of a souk that you went round.
Souk, did you say?
The souk, yes, the market.
Okay.
So you disappear into.
Did you go to Fez?
We went to Fez. We went to Meknes. We went to the imperial cities, the 4 imperial cities, and then we stayed for about 10 days up above Marrakesh into the Atlas, basically walking. It was a Scout and Guide Club from university on tour. And this time we didn't bring the gearbox and the Land Rover back in 4 cardboard boxes, which they'd done the previous time.
Were you all engineering students?
No, there were a fair few of us, but no, it's a good mix. We had some medics, which was quite useful.
Yes, yes, yes.
But yes, we went climbing and scree running and so on.
So have you been back to Morocco since?
No, I've never been back to Morocco.
But it obviously had quite a sort of an impression on you at that stage.
Well, of course, it's the first time I've been to somewhere where you went from the rich part of the country, or and the very highly decorated art of the Stadian tombs and Marrakesh and so on, into areas which were at the other end of the spectrum. And then you went out and saw the Bedouin out on the Sahara plains and so on, the camel trade still across the Sahara. So, it was a complete travel into the unknown, I suppose.
The contrast of cultures, I suppose.
Yeah, you just couldn't really figure it out. And of course, it was still very much a French enclave.
Yeah.
And yet it wasn't. And there were several cultures. There were the desert Arabs, there were the Moors of the coast. Yeah. So you had the Berbers, Arabs and so on, all mixed together. And so it was a real sort of crossing of cultures.
Mm.
Very, very.
You went back to university. Which university did you go to?
I was in Cambridge, so we went down from Cambridge to Morocco.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. So,
yeah.
So you went back to your studies and you went into work. And tell us, what other sort of book would you like to choose to tell us about now?
Where should we go next, Simon? I suppose let's go and look at this one. This is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Okay.
Which is one that.
Did you say Silent Spring?
Silent Spring. So it was her book written in 1962, which is probably the start of our understanding, certainly at a sort of popular level, of the impact of, in this case, wide-scale use of DDT and other sort of insecticides on crops, and the impact it had on bird life in particular here. So it's the start of conservation and ecology and understanding that these are big systems. And I worked all my life basically as a systems engineer. That's my background. And so I think in systems. Yeah. Most people don't, but a lot of people do. And this was around the thinking that things we were doing on a pretty haphazard way. We were spraying fields. In this case, Rachel Carson was in the States. She was a marine biologist. Some other good books of hers which are good on the oceans and the sea. But this is one that says, look, there's something going on out there that we really ought to take seriously. Mm. So it's a great book to think about where we started getting these big agricultural impacts on the world that I like going to look at, wildlife and all that lot.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this is that I've heard the term silent forest, and a silent forest is one where all the vegetation has been destroyed, somebody's introduced some kind of chemical imbalance, or they've created some imbalance of the fauna, and so nothing grows, and it becomes a desert, I suppose. So is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yes, this was the book that made a huge impact on President Kennedy in his short spell in the White House. It was that sort of vintage, 62-ish, when Silent Spring was published, and it was just setting the case from observation that where there were these big, extensive prairie agriculture in the United States, and a great reliance on what we now refer to as chemical agriculture. Mm. So spraying fields with, in pesticides particularly, that suddenly we lost all the songbirds. We lost all our natural wildlife. And this was a real clarion call that says, hey, we've got to do something about this. We've got to do something differently. Yeah, yeah. And so it's a book which I pull out every so often because it takes you back to thinking what we observe tells us something. And we usually don't realize it until we sit down and really think. Mm.
But I mean, the book obviously had an impact on you, but we're talking about something that was almost 60 years ago. So how come we're still talking about climate change and this kind of problem?
Because we haven't fixed it. And we still look at, I've forgotten when the original books that referred to ecology came out. They're that sort of vintage. So in that period, the early 60s, when I was sort of at school trying to be a geographer, as that was my sort of fascination at the time. And you look back and those people who were writing at that time, it's still relevant. Mm. And it's still relevant because we're still spraying fields with herbicides, we're still spraying fields with pesticides. And of course, just go where you want them to go. They go everywhere.
No. And nobody knows where they end. You know,
well, they run off into the rivers, and we certainly know that if you put some of the fertilizers and spray those, they end up in the nitrogen ends up in the river, and the rivers get clogged with all the things that get encouraged to grow that you didn't want there in the first place.
Would you call yourself a climate campaigner, Vaughan?
That's an interesting term. I don't like the idea of campaigning. I'm certainly one that will say things about it and get slightly heated about it, and try and do something that I can do about it. So yeah, I suppose if that's a campaigner, I'm probably one of those.
That's very good. Now, Vaughan, move on to your third book. Tell us about the third book that you've chosen.
Well, if you think that's an old book, we'll go back even further. You know, this is one that I pull out occasionally.
What is it?
I have here an original copy of this is a pamphlet, by the way, by Samuel Plimsoll, called Our Seaman, which is, you know, I spent 30 years in shipping as a regulator, safety regulator. So, you know, a lot of our work went back to big things that went wrong. One was the Titanic, obviously.
Yeah. That
sank. And the other was Plimsoll. And we all see the mark on the side of the ship and refer to it without knowing what it is.
Yes.
And I've got a pile of books on the floor, which is sort of bought with the intention of writing some of this up, as, you know, what's happened since Plimsoll.
Remind us what the Plimsoll line is all about.
Well, this was the idea that Plimsoll was an MP, and what he was campaigning for was the safety of the ships, particularly on the coal trade from Newcastle to London. And they were sinking. And they were sinking because A, they were in a rotten state, and secondly, because they were overloaded. And he campaigned that ships should be maintained in good condition. Seems obvious, doesn't it? And that they should be marked with a load line that was the limit of loading, which is the little, what my daughter referred to once to my acute embarrassment as, why did they paint a bus stop on the side of ships, Daddy? Didn't go down too well. But, you know, that little bus stop on the side of the ship.
Yeah, exactly right. No, you can see why she was confused.
Yeah, so I pulled this book out because it's actually got some really good data in it. It was a very, very rigorous study of what was actually being lost at the time, how ships were sinking, and why ships were sinking. And it brought in the changes in the Merchant Shipping Act.
Yeah.
That meant we, in the future, had statutory requirements for the maintenance of ships and for the loading.
And is that what you were involved with in your career?
Well, I spent 30 years at Lloyd's Register, and we were a classification society. So, yes, surveying ships. Somebody said once, when I was technical director, what was I doing? Well, I was sort of responsible for the safety of 7,000 ships. So, yes, the safety of shipping particularly, but engineering, safety of engineering is, I suppose, what I've spent most of my 50 years since graduation on.
Lloyd's Register, is that anything to do with ringing a bell when a ship goes?
No. The Lloyd's of London insurance market has the lutein bell, which rings when a casualty sinks. And the register was originally it was a register of ships for underwriters, which had little marks in which said whether they were good, middling or bad. And progressively it became a classification society, and they were an independent organisation. So it started in the same coffee house, but apart from that, you know, when I retired in 2010, it was the 250th year since the founding of the Class Society. So we've been in business a long time, surveying ships. We knew a bit about what we were doing. Yeah,
very interesting. So, Vaughan, move on to your fourth book for us.
Where should we go next? Information is Beautiful. That's a good book. It's a lovely book which has some great illustrations by David McCandless.
Where did it come from?
Where did it come from?
Did you buy it?
Well, I did actually buy my own copy, and then Anne gave me one for Christmas one year.
Ah.
So I ended up with two, and the little note in says, having second thoughts about this, or having kittens about this, because I think you might have already bought it.
Ah.
But never mind, it's always worth having two copies, which is true, actually. It's one of these glorious books which shows different ways of illustrating things. And I always spent a long time lecturing and talking to all sorts of people. And part of that is around how you illustrate slides. There's nothing more boring than death by PowerPoint. So my lectures always used to just have a pile of pictures. And this was about getting the graphics right for how you represented different things. And I can't remember which picture it was that made Anne buy it. I can't remember which one it made me buy it, but it was a sort of comparison of what a ton of CO2 looks like and where it comes from and so on. So it's a really good book about how you present information to convey messages.
Yeah.
And of course, if you look at all the graphs that are going up currently with this COVID problem, they're not very informative. They're just not very clever. So this is a good way of thinking about information.
How would you like to see the government graphs improved?
Well, I think there's a lot of difficulties in presenting that sort of data, and some of them, if you notice, are presented with a logarithmic scale on them.
What's that?
Well, on one axis, instead of producing the raw numbers, you're producing the log of the raw number.
Okay.
So the gap is 10, 100, 1,000 as you go up the side. Now, that makes the graphs a different shape than if you produce the raw numbers. And most people do not understand that. They're leveling off, but they're leveling off in a different sort of way than you conventionally think of them. They're still going up quite fast, and the slope doesn't look as steep as it was. So, I think when you present information, it's got to be clear to the intended audience. And it depends what the intended audience is.
Can you think of an example of how you use that book to inspire one of your audiences?
Well, I think the things that it shows are that if you present, for example, little circles for representing the scale, the size of something.
Yeah.
Of course, is it the area of the circle or the diameter of the circle, which is the character that you're modelling? And a circle obviously is a square of the radius comes in, and it can be very confusing as to how you use those if you're using them to indicate different scales. And you have to sort of understand how you present that as to whether it means something.
Yeah. So the way in which you present information is very important for the audience. You've got to make sure that it's understandable by the people who are looking at it.
Well, it's got to convey the message you want to convey. And of course, you can use it in a way that conveys a message that isn't perhaps justified. So when you present graphs that have a slightly unusual scale on them to most people, they may appear to be giving you a different message than you think you're getting. And so it's about that clarity of message.
Yeah. I think I would have appreciated that book when I was teaching.
I'm sure you would, because it uses different sort of graphics and different sort of scaling factors.
Yeah.
That give you a measure of size, and comparing sizes, comparing scale of numbers and so on is actually very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
We were in a conversation recently with a society where they were using the comparison as a modern ship being so many times the size of the Titanic. Now, what size do you mean? Do you mean the length? Do you mean the tonnage, which is a volume? Do you mean the number of passengers? And it doesn't mean anything because none of us have seen the original thing you're comparing.
Yes, yeah, you can't relate it. Yeah,
You've got to relate it to something you understand.
mm.
And most of us don't understand big numbers.
Yes, that's very interesting. Vaughan, can we move on to your fifth book?
The fifth book was one that I read recently. It's a big, heavy tome, and that's Tom Wright's biography of St. Paul.
Okay.
Now, the fact it says a biography on the front does make it sort of kind of interesting when you walk around the shop.
You imagine that he's met him at some point.
Well, and Tom Wright, former Bishop of Durham, you wouldn't necessarily think of a biography. More, you'd think about like his previous books where he has, Paul for Everyone or whatever.
Yeah.
A modern sort of translation support.
An analysis of his life or something.
Yeah, but an analysis or a book based on the letters and basically taking the text and talking you through it. This is actually written as a biography. So it has a lot of the historical and I suppose social background behind Paul.
Yeah.
And about the meeting in Jerusalem where he got shipped down to talk to the apostles left working with the church in Jerusalem. And it talks about his own situation when he was writing certain things, who he was writing to, what the journeys were, and so forth. So it paints a very useful picture, or did for me, about understanding the situation where things were written.
Yes. It
adds a sort of bigger depth, I found, to just studying or reading the letters of Paul.
Well, Vaughan, I've got a copy of that book and I started reading it. And as you say, it is a big, thick tome. So
pages.
If you finished it, well done to you, because I'm still ploughing through it. But what I learned was that Paul, there was 10 years after Paul's conversion before he started any missionary journey. And Tom Wright tries to analyse what he might have done during that 10 years. And I found that was really interesting, a real eye-opener into the person of St. Paul, and something that we just skip over because in the Bible we're not given any information about that 10 years. But Tom Wright sort of makes some suggestions which I find very helpful.
Yes, I think there's a danger that it's possible to read it and think, well, actually, is there a strong enough basis in fact, if you like, or is it more like one of these modern biographies that's better filed under fiction?
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount that makes you think, but it raises a lot of questions. It provides plausible answers to them, and it sets in context the idea of what the situation was when he was writing from prison, or what he went under arrest, or what that meant in the circumstances. So I think do
you think the book has sort of changed the way in which you read the letters of St. Paul now?
Yeah. Yes, I think it changes the yes, because you understand a little bit more about who the letters were written to and what circumstance they were written in, and therefore making sense of some of the slightly more curious parts becomes much easier, because you can see that if you're writing to the people of wherever, Corinth, at a particular time, there were certain things that were, if you like, small local issues to be resolved and bigger philosophical issues to be conveyed. And I think the way that it's turned out in the biography does support the books that Tom Wright's written in terms of Paul's letters for everyone.
Yes, yeah.
So I think it's just a fascinating way of doing these things.
Mm. And you can't imagine Tom Wright sort of inventing things for the sake of it. He would have gone to a great deal of trouble to try and represent the true life of St. Paul.
Yeah, and it's a best guess in places. As you say, you know, what did he do for 10 years? Well, there's a best guess in there.
Mm.
That he was back there making tents or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But it's not a book that's easy to sit down and say, well, I'll read this over a couple of afternoons.
No, it's a real study, isn't it?
But you need to go and look everything up as you go along. It's pretty well self-contained.
And dense, yes.
But heavy.
Know that you've got a stack of books that represent your life, and it would be really interesting to go through more of them. But I'm going to call it a day there, simply because, you know, you've given us a fascinating insight into five books that you've got on your shelves, which I think it's helped me to understand you a little bit better, get to know you a little bit better. And I hope that, you know, if other people in the church look at this as well, they'll, you know, start to realize, like I do, what an interesting person you are. So thank you very much for sharing all those thoughts.
Great fun. Okay, Simon.